线长山又高，处处港口都险要。
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Straight Talk with Xiangyu, where we dive deep into the Taiwan Strait, a pivotal frontline of the battle between Western hegemony and Eastern resistance, bringing you a perspective of Taiwan, the rest of China, cross-strait relations, and beyond, not typically covered by mainstream media. So today, for the first time, we don't have a guest, so it's just going to be me, trying my best to share information on my own while keeping it engaging. I think after quite a few episodes on very specific topics, like the chip industry, for example, I'd like to do an episode, or rather a series, and get into the history of Taiwan separatism and how it was a fringe ideology that gained traction because of the KMT's policy errors as well as external factors such as US meddling. Now, I'm currently writing a book covering the fundamentals of the Taiwan question, and I had to think quite a bit about how to explain this content in a simple and straightforward way that doesn't gloss over very important nuances. So I think now is the perfect time to go in depth about this history while it's still fresh in my head. So to begin, I think one of the most important things to understand is the difference between Taiwan and the so-called Republic of China. The Republic of China was the Chinese government founded on January 1st, 1912, which was then usurped by Yuan Shikai before the country fell to warlordism, followed by the country being nominally reunified under KMT rule in 1928 after the victory of the Northern Expedition, which was launched in 1926. I mean, this period alone has enough history for many episodes, so I'm just going to keep it very brief, because this episode's focus is on the origins of Taiwan separatism. Anyways, this Republic of China would be the sole legitimate government of China until it was defeated by the communists in 1949. And now you might wonder why Taiwan hasn't been mentioned in my little history of the Republic of China yet. That's because when the Republic of China was founded in 1912, or when it was reconstituted in 1928, Taiwan was a Japanese colony. So when pro-China Westerners say something stupid like Taiwan started the Chinese Civil War, they're failing to differentiate between the ROC, the KMT, and Taiwan. Taiwan's history didn't begin with the Chinese Civil War or with Chiang Kai-shek's retreat to the island in 1949. The first time Taiwan, the island, was mentioned in Chinese history was during the Three Kingdoms era in about 230 AD, though back then the island wasn't known as Taiwan at the time, but rather Yizhou and later Liuqiu before the name Taiwan came to common usage. The name Taiwan is believed to be derived from Dayovan. I don't know how exactly you say it, but it's supposed to be what the indigenous Shiraya people called a specific area they inhabited on the island. And over time, Taiwan came to denote the entire island and was officially adopted as the island's name during the Qing dynasty. Formosa, on the other hand, became the name of the island in the west for a long time because when Magellan encountered the island for the first time, he called it Ilha Formosa, which means beautiful island in Portuguese. I'm probably not saying it right, but oh well. Long story short, when the Ming Dynasty fell, a man by the name of Zheng Chenggong came to Taiwan, defeated the Dutch who had a colony on the island that employed Chinese labor, set up a rump state from which he hoped to restore the Ming Dynasty, and then his grandson surrendered to the Qing Dynasty, and Taiwan was incorporated into the Qing Empire as a part of Fujian province before it became its own province in 1885. From the 17th century until Taiwan became a Japanese colony in 1895, Taiwan gradually became a majority Han society as migrants from southern Fujian, and to a lesser extent from a place called Meixian in Guangdong province, kept arriving to the island. Now, indigenous people in the plains areas eventually assimilated into Han culture as the two cultures interacted and intermarried. So before Taiwan became a Japanese colony and before the 13 American colonies declared independence from Britain, Taiwan was already fully integrated into Chinese civilization, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that Taiwan was a part of China and that its population was Chinese. In 1895, China lost the First Sino-Japanese War in a humiliating defeat and was forced to cede Taiwan to Japan, and Taiwan would remain a Japanese colony until 1945 when Japan was defeated in World War II. Now, this is a very significant historical development because for the first time since Taiwan's incorporation into Chinese civilization, Taiwan was separated from the rest of China for 50 years, living under a different system and eventually a different level of economic development. People might notice that anti-Japanese sentiment in Taiwan today is nearly non-existent when compared to another former colony of Japan's, namely Korea. And this is due to a number of reasons, some of which have to do with the emergence of Taiwan separatism as an ideology. So Korea became a Japanese colony in 1910, meaning it was a Japanese colony for 35 years, 15 years shorter than Taiwan was a Japanese colony. Now, when Japan first took over Taiwan in 1895, the colonial administration faced a lot of resistance from the local population. And the first opposition movement against the Japanese began right after Taiwan was ceded. It's what we now call the Republic of Formosa, which some separatists today who don't know their history, look up to for inspiration because, there was some sort of declaration of independence. But it was a declaration of separatism from Japan with the goal of reintegrating Taiwan back into the Qing Empire. Now, this resistance movement was quickly subdued by the Japanese, who carried out countless massacres and violent crackdowns during the first half of their rule over Taiwan. But eventually, the Japanese realized that these methods would lead to long-term instability and resentment, so they eventually implemented a softer form of colonization, or a softer approach to colonization, which included significant investments in infrastructure, public health, education, economic development. And all of this was basically aimed at winning the loyalty of the Taiwanese people by improving their living conditions and fostering a shared identity with the Japanese Empire. Korea, on the other hand, wasn't colonized long enough for the Japanese to switch over to a softer form of imperial domination like they were able to during the second half of Taiwan's colonization. That being said, though, this isn't to say that Taiwan's colonial subjects were seen or treated as equals, and Taiwan was ultimately still a colony to be exploited for Japan's benefit. However, like Carl and I mentioned in episode 0 of this podcast, there was a class of local elites who benefited during Japanese colonization. So to facilitate their colonial project, the Japanese authorities sought to integrate and leverage the existing social structures to streamline governance. So consequently, wealthy landowners and other influential figures in local society enjoyed a privileged status as a class, even though they were still colonial subjects. And some members of this wealthy class of local elites were co-opted into local governance structures, and others were appointed to advisory roles or local councils, giving them quite a bit of influence and power in local affairs. So because of this, many individuals from this powerful but minority class developed sympathies for their Japanese overlords. Now, we all know that in August of 1945, the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and immediately afterwards, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. So it became very clear at this point that Japan would surrender and that Taiwan would be returned to China. Now, local elites in Taiwan who were concerned with their own interests colluded with the hardline faction of the Japanese military that was stationed in Japan, and they convened an emergency meeting in what is now called Yangmingshan in Taipei to discuss Taiwan independence, and they demanded that the Japanese Governor General of Taiwan lead them in declaring independence. These people sought support from their former colonial rulers to prevent Taiwan from returning to China, with some even openly urging the Imperial Japanese Army to resist the incoming Chinese troops and block the handover of Taiwan. However, the Japanese emperor sent an order to the Governor General prohibiting any disruptive actions and explicitly banning separatist activities across Taiwan. So the local elite's demands were rejected by the Governor General. Now over here, I want to go over the legal basis for Taiwan's return to China. In 1945, Japan stated in its instrument of surrender, "We hereby undertake for the emperor, the Japanese government, and their successors to carry out the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration in good faith, and to issue whatever orders and take whatever action may be required by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers or any other designated representative of the Allied Powers for the purpose of giving effect to that declaration. So over here, we see that the Potsdam Declaration was being mentioned. The Potsdam Declaration was issued by the leaders of the United States, the Republic of China, and Great Britain, and defined the terms for Japanese surrender. Now, carrying out the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration in good faith means surrendering Taiwan to China because Clause 8 of the Potsdam Declaration specifies the terms of the Cairo Declaration shall be carried out and Japanese sovereignty shall be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine. Now you might say that this says nothing about China, but it does specifically state that the terms of the Cairo Declaration will be carried out. And the Cairo Declaration in terms says, all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, such as Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores, shall be restored to the Republic of China. And Formosa is what Taiwan was more commonly known as in the West, and the Pescadores refer to the Penghu Islands. So in 1945, there was no dispute regarding Taiwan's return to China, and the U.S. was actively engaged in mediating the conflict between the Communist Party and the KMT to ensure stability and unification in China, with the goal of preventing the emergence of a communist China and to maintain China as a key partner in the Asia-Pacific region that's allied with American interests. However, as attempts to form a coalition government between the KMT and CPC failed, and the situation increasingly favored the communists, the US recognized that the KMT would likely lose control of the mainland and be left with Taiwan as its final stronghold. At this time, more and more American voices were against the continued support for Chiang Kai-shek. And so the conspiracies to divorce Taiwan from China began, but failed. I think the important thing to mention is the US's main concern about Taiwan has always been about keeping it within the US sphere of influence, because Taiwan is part of what is known as the First Island Chain, which surrounds the Chinese mainland, with Taiwan right in the center. If Taiwan were reunified with a Chinese mainland that's not friendly with the US, then that means China has unfettered access to the Pacific. Now, once Chiang Kai-shek lost the mainland, the US didn't care about his continued claims over the mainland, because his job from the American perspective was simply to prevent communism from spreading to Taiwan. But before the US decided to renew support for Chiang Kai-shek, it explored various options to ensure Taiwan stay out of communist hands. One of the options discussed was the possibility of returning the newly liberated Taiwan to its former colonizer, Japan. Another idea that was considered was the establishment of a new state on the island. So, in February 1949, Secretary of State D. Natchison dispatched diplomat Livingston T. Merchant on a mission to meet with Chen Cheng, the provincial governor of Taiwan at the time. Merchant pitched to Chen Cheng the idea of declaring Taiwan's independence from the Republic of China in exchange for aid, and under this proposal, Allied forces would occupy Taiwan before transferring power to a newly established Taiwanese republic. The US would then deploy its Navy and Air Force to the Taiwan Strait to deter any attacks on the new republic, and if Chiang Kai-shek wanted to come to Taiwan after being defeated on the mainland, he would have to come as a political refugee from another country, rather than as the leader of a government retreating to its final stronghold within China. But Chen Cheng refused to entertain the idea of turning Taiwan into a separate country, so this idea never materialized. The PRC was established in Beijing on October 1st, 1949, and Chiang Kai-shek, along with his forces, retreated to Taiwan in December of that year. At this time, there was considerable internal debate within the US government about whether or not to recognize the PRC. American businessmen with interests in China reported to the US government that the newly established People's Government received considerable popular support and wasn't just some puppet regime of the Soviet Union like many thought it was. At the same time, US policymakers aligned with the military were much more hawkish towards the new Beijing government, but generally, Chiang Kai-shek's supporters in the US government were dismayed with his loss of the mainland and questioned the efficacy of his leadership, which led to debates about the future of US support for him. Now, Some factions of the government advocated a hands-off approach, suggesting the best course of action would be to allow the communists to land in Taiwan and thoroughly defeat the Chiang Kai-shek regime. On the other end of the spectrum were hawkish elements who sought the defeat of the communists on the Chinese mainland and supported Chiang Kai-shek's ambitions to reclaim it. In between these two extremes was a pragmatic position focused on maintaining relations with the KMT on Taiwan, while also seeking to engage with the CPC on the mainland, aiming to leverage historical antagonisms and drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union, while also keeping Taiwan out of control of the communists. Now, if you don't know, a lot of former Chinese territory was annexed by the Russian Empire in the past, and Mongolia was carved from China with Soviet support. Not to mention, Russia was one of the participants of the Eight-Nation Alliance that invaded China. So there were lots of lingering anti-Russian sentiments in China despite the alliance between the communist parties of the two countries. But ultimately, what renewed US support towards Chiang Kai-shek was the Korean War, which intensified fears of communist expansion within the US ruling class. At this point, the Truman administration decided to renew support for Chiang because they saw his regime on Taiwan as a crucial anti-communist ally in the Asia-Pacific, and MacArthur famously referred to Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which underscored Taiwan's strategic importance to US military and geopolitical interests in the region. So the US Navy's 7th Fleet was deployed to the Taiwan Strait not only to prevent communist forces from advancing on Taiwan, but to also restrain Chiang's forces from causing further instability by launching counterattacks on the mainland. So from this, we can see that US support for Chiang Kai-shek was driven more by pragmatic considerations rather than by ideological alignment. For example, Chiang Kai-shek firmly opposed any attempts to formalize a two-China situation or to encourage Taiwan separatism, and during his leadership, people who advocated for Taiwan separatism were thrown in jail for treason. The US, though, really only cared about keeping Taiwan outside of Beijing's control, and it just so happened that Chiang Kai-shek was the best person to get this job done. But that doesn't mean the US was fundamentally against Taiwan separatists, and as we can see from the developments in the following decades, the US shifted its strategy by supporting the liberal opposition movement against the KMT and pressuring the KMT to implement liberal reforms. So now I'm going to introduce a very important concept, one that the hardline separatists today still try to use as legal justification for their ideology, which is the theory of Taiwan's undetermined status. I need to reiterate, Chiang Kai-shek did not establish a new government when he arrived to Taiwan. What happened was his government continued to operate as the so-called Republic of China and continued to assert itself as the legitimate government of China, labeling the communists in Beijing as illegitimate usurpers. The PRC declared itself the successor state to the Republic of China and views the Taipei-based so-called Republic of China as the administration of a renegade regime within the People's Republic of China. Foreigners sympathetic to Beijing but unfamiliar with Chinese perspectives on China's history and territory might perceive Chiang Kai-shek's continued claims over the mainland as an act of aggression. But it's crucial to recognize that this claim means that he and the CPC both agree that China is one country and that the conflict is between two political entities within the same country vying for complete control of the country. If Beijing were to give up claims over Taiwan, or if Taipei were to formally give up claims over the mainland, then it's the declaration of two Chinas, or one country on each side. Now, there's a slight, subtle difference between the two. Two Chinas means giving up on reunification and recognizing the territories controlled by Beijing and Taipei as two distinct Chinese countries. But the thing is, throughout China's millennia of history, which is marked by periods of division and reunification, warring kingdoms did not view their territories as separate countries, but as parts of a singular Chinese realm, and their ultimate objective was always to reunite the entirety of China under a single rule. Taiwan separatism, on the other hand, or One China, One Taiwan, is basically rage quitting from this game and advocating the establishment of a Republic of Taiwan distinct from China, and it aims to develop a new cultural identity that does not identify as Chinese. And I'm mentioning these definitions because when the US renewed support towards Chiang Kai-shek in 1950, the US ruling class was still keeping the door open for either two Chinas or one China and one Taiwan, which was made evident when it concocted the theory of Taiwan's undetermined status. So basically, when the Treaty of San Francisco was signed on September 8, 1951 to formally end the war between Japan and the Allied powers, China was excluded from the treaty even though it was one of the Allied powers. The reasoning was that none of the 48 countries that signed the treaty had diplomatic ties with the PRC at the time. And there were concerns that including the so-called ROC in the treaty would be contentious since the so-called ROC had lost control over the majority of China. But the real intention of excluding Taipei from the treaty was to allow US-led Western powers to craft a treaty that aligned with their strategic interests and political considerations more freely. And so the US had Taipei and Tokyo sign a separate treaty called the Treaty of Taipei on April 28, 1952, which happens to be the exact same date the Treaty of San Francisco became effective. So Article 2B of the Treaty of San Francisco says, Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to Formosa and the Pescadores. This left Taiwan's status ambiguous by not explicitly transferring sovereignty over Taiwan from Japan to either the PRC or the so-called ROC. And this ambiguity allowed the US to argue that Taiwan was not legally Chinese territory, but instead just entrusted to the KMT until final arrangements were made. Taiwan separatists argue that the Cairo and Potsdam declarations were not legally binding since they were political statements rather than formal treaties. But the Japanese instrument of surrender, which I quoted earlier, references both declarations and was included in Volume 59 of the U.S. Statutes at Large, as well as Volume 139 of the UN Treaty Series. So this means that the provisions of the Cairo and Potsdam declarations are parts of a valid international agreement. But then the US quickly nullifies the theory of Taiwan's undetermined status in another treaty that it concluded with Taipei. So after the Korean War, the Taiwan Strait became a more active conflict zone, with the PLA intensifying its military pressure on KMT positions along the strait, which led to a series of skirmishes and artillery exchanges between the two armies. So in response, the KMT ramped up its fortification efforts on the Dachan Islands, which were islands in Zhejiang province that were still under Taipei's control at the time. Meanwhile, imperialist efforts to contain the spread of communism were in full swing. So it was under this context that Taipei and Washington concluded the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Republic of China in December 1954, which was basically a treaty where both parties agreed that an attack on either in their respective territories would be considered an attack against both. During the negotiations leading up to this treaty, Chiang Kai-shek was not happy with Article 6 of the treaty, which I'll read to you guys right now. For the purposes of Article 2 and 5, the terms territorial and territories shall mean in respect of the Republic of China, Taiwan and the Pescadores, and in respect of the United States of America, the island territories in the West Pacific under its jurisdiction. The provisions of Articles 2 and 5 will be applicable to such other territories as may be determined by mutual agreement. Chiang Kai-shek was upset by this because by defining the territory of the so-called Republic of China as Taiwan and Penghu, or the Pescadores, instead of China in its entirety, the US was basically signaling its reluctance to truly uphold the territorial claims of the so-called Republic of China, or the idea that the so-called Republic of China was the sole legitimate government of China. This definition also suggested that the US was trying to avoid committing itself to assist Chiang Kai-shek in maintaining control over Kinmen-matsu, two groups of offshore islands that are part of Fujian province but under Taipei's control. However, because Taiwan and Penghu were defined as territories of the so-called Republic of China in a legally binding treaty between Taipei and Washington, the theory of Taiwan's undetermined status was effectively nullified by its very creator, the United States. So in 1951, the US recognized in the Treaty of San Francisco that Japan surrendered Taiwan and Penghu, and in 1954, the US recognized that Taiwan and Penghu are territories of the so-called Republic of China, meaning the US can no longer argue that Taiwan's status is undetermined. Of course, the CPC was not happy that the US signed such a treaty with Taipei at all, and considered it a violation of China's sovereignty. So in response, the PLA liberated the Dacheng Islands and Zhejiang to gain control over crucial territories. This move was also intended to test American commitment to the Chiang Kai-shek regime, since the Mutual Defense Treaty's terms notably excluded Dacheng and Zhejiang in addition to Kinmen and Matsu and Fujian. Eisenhower responded to these developments by signing the Formosa Resolution of 1955, which authorized him to, in the words of the resolution, employ the armed forces of the United States as he deems necessary for the specific purpose of securing and protecting Formosa and the pescadores against armed attack. But similar to the Mutual Defense Treaty, the resolution did not cover Kinmen and Matsu. In less than a month, the U.S. 7th Fleet evacuated the entire population of the Dacheng Islands to Taiwan shortly before the PLA captured them. And as a quick aside, I think I might do an episode on the 1955 migrants from Dacheng because for whatever reason, a lot of my parents' friends in the Chinese restaurant circles where I grew up in America came from Dacheng. And whereas a lot of people, even in Taiwan, don't even know of these people or where Dacheng is, I grew up hearing a lot of their stories, including some older people who were alive during the evacuation. Now, then, on August 23rd, 1958, Mao Zedong initiated the Battle of Kinmen to once again gauge the extent of U.S. support for the Taipei regime on Taiwan. The PLA launched a heavy artillery bombardment on Kinmen, while KMT forces with U.S. assistance mounted a determined defense. During the conflict, Mao instructed the PLA to act as if U.S. planes and ships were not there and to not engage with them at all. This was to prevent escalation of the conflict into a broader Sino-American war. And it was also to emphasize that the conflict was an internal Chinese issue rather than an international confrontation. Although the Mutual Defense Treaty effectively nullified the theory of Taiwan's undetermined status, the U.S. continued to leverage Taiwan separatism to further its geopolitical interests. And an example of this was U.S. diplomat and strategist Robert McClintock proposing a plan to transform Taiwan into the Austria of East Asia by turning it into a neutral zone. This plan involved allowing the CPC to take control of Kinmen and Matsu, to turn the Taiwan Strait itself into a buffer zone between the two sides, and through this, avoid direct military confrontation between the US and China. And in accordance to this idea, the US encouraged Chiang Kai-shek to remove his forces from Kinmen and Matsu in hopes of creating a physical and psychological separation between the territories held by Taipei and those controlled by Beijing. Because keep in mind, Kinmen and Xiamen are only separated by a few miles. The narrowest part of the Taiwan Strait, on the other hand, is 130 kilometers or 81 miles. Then, on September 30th, 1958, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles expressed the U.S.'s willingness to facilitate the KMT's withdrawal from Kinmen and Matsu, provided the CPC agreed to a ceasefire along the Taiwan Strait. And this is why I say Chiang Kai-shek was a bastard, but he's our bastard. Because he refused this offer for a number of reasons. One being that he still hoped to one day launch a counteroffensive against the communists and recapture the mainland, but also because a retreat would have had a negative impact on morale and not only embolden communists, but also fuel separatist sentiments. Mao Zedong similarly recognized the strategic importance of Kinmen and Matsu as a physical and symbolic link between Taiwan and the mainland. So he chose to allow Taipei to maintain control of these islands. And so by keeping those islands under Taipei's control, both Mao and Zhang made sure these islands remained a metaphorical umbilical cord connecting Taiwan to the mainland. So once this tacit agreement was made, both sides de-escalated and they ended up shelling each other on alternating days. I think foreigners don't get the significance of this, but this shelling was a symbolic gesture to remind the US and the international community that the conflict between the CPC and KMT was a domestic problem and that both sides were committed to Chinese reunification and reject attempts to either create two Chinas or separate Taiwan from China. And the shelling would continue with decreasing intensity and frequency before Deng Xiaoping announced the end of the shelling on January 1st, 1979, when diplomatic ties between Beijing and Washington were formally established. And I'm talking about all of these factors before really getting into the internal factors that led to the rise of Taiwan separatism, because Taiwan separatism today would not be what it is without both the internal and external. It really is a marriage between imperialist designs for the region and the contradictions within the island after the war. So in the aftermath of 1949, various proposals emerged in the UN to address the situation between Taiwan and the mainland. One of them was, of course, Taiwan independence, which meant recognizing the PRC as a legitimate government of China while excluding Taiwan from that China and establishing an independent republic on Taiwan. One proposed name for a state like this was Chinese Formosa. Another proposal was a UN trusteeship, which meant declaring Taiwan's status as undetermined and having the UN govern Taiwan temporarily. A third idea was the one and a half Chinas concept, which would make Taiwan a vassal state of the PRC essentially, and let it operate under what's basically a one country, two systems arrangement, but also allowing Taiwan to represent itself independently in foreign affairs. Then, of course, there was the two successor state solution, which proposed recognizing both the PRC and the so-called ROC as founding members of the UN. So basically a two China situation. The US Secretary of State, Dulles, suggested having the PRC on the Security Council while the so-called ROC would remain in the General Assembly. So as you can see, the US was really wishing for some sort of formalized divide between Taiwan and the mainland, basically to secure its first island chain and contain the potential spread of communism. On September 23rd, 1954, Zhou Enlai criticized these proposals as attempts to undermine China's territorial integrity. And in another case of Chiang Kai-shek being a bastard but our bastard, he rejected all of these proposals as well for similar reasons. So this puts Chiang Kai-shek in a pretty interesting position because he's certainly no friend of Taiwan separatists, but his reliance on Americans to stay in power and the US being against even Chiang Kai-shek's vision of Chinese reunification would nonetheless provide fertile ground for separatist ideology to rise. On October 16th, 1954, Chiang Kai-shek declared that Taiwan would never adopt a neutral stance, would always stand resolutely against communism, and would never give up on its goal of returning to the mainland. To Chiang Kai-shek, the Taiwan area was not a separate country, but rather a base of operations within China for the eventual reunification of the country under the so-called ROC banner. So as we know, as far as the situation in the UN goes, the so-called ROC occupied China's seat until UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 was passed in 1971, which resulted in the PRC becoming the representative government of China in the UN. Since the UN upholds the position that the PRC is the sole legitimate government of China and that Taiwan is a part of China, Taiwan is technically represented in the UN today in a manner similar to how the mainland was technically represented between 1949 and 1971. Because there's never been a situation of two Chinas or one China and one Taiwan in the UN. Now finally, we're going to talk about the birth of Taiwan separatism as a fringe ideology. So Taiwan separatism began as a fringe ideology with adherents from various backgrounds, including local elites who had benefited greatly during Japanese colonization, a middle class that was ideologically influenced by their former colonial authorities, certain groups swayed by American influence, liberalism and all that, as well as ordinary people who came to support the cause after being disillusioned by the corruption and despotism of the KMT. But the core figures of the movement largely came from Taiwan's local elites, and I'm going to reintroduce Taiwan's demographics briefly so the rest of this will make sense. The term 本省人 it means people whose families were already in Taiwan by the time Japan surrendered. And this term literally means people of this province. The families of 本省人 began arriving to Taiwan in large numbers in the 17th century all the way throughout the Qing dynasty. And most 本省人 traced their roots to southern Fujian, while a minority of 本省人 traced their roots to the Meishan area in Guangdong. 本省人 make up the overwhelming majority of Taiwan's population, and while the term 本省人 technically includes the indigenous population, it's predominantly used to differentiate between the two broad categories of Han people over here in Taiwan. Now keep in mind that Taiwan was already a Han majority society by the time the KMT arrived. Then there's 外省人, which literally means people from other provinces. And it's estimated that around 1.5 to 2 million 外省人 arrived to Taiwan between 1945 and the mid-1950s, with most of them arriving in 1949. Although a considerable number of them were government officials, intellectuals, professionals, landowners, and businessmen, approximately 600 to 700,000 arrived as lower-ranking military personnel who later became working civilians. So even among these two broad categories, 本省人 and 外省人, there are class divides. Now, as newcomers from the mainland, the first generation of 外省人 were not considered Taiwanese by either themselves or by 本省人. Their children were not recognized as Taiwanese either until, I'd say, the late 20th century, when the meaning of the term Taiwanese was broadened to include 外省人. The distinction between 本省人 and 外省人 is becoming increasingly blurred since 外省人 have resided in Taiwan now for multiple generations, and intermarriage between these two groups is pretty common. So it's hard to determine the exact number of 外省人 in Taiwan today, but estimates suggest that they make up about 10 to 15% of Taiwan's current population. The important thing to note is that prior to constitutional reforms that introduced the direct election of Taiwan's leader, the so-called president was appointed by the so-called National Assembly, whose members were originally meant to be elected by citizens all across China. Now, the last time the National Assembly of the ROC was elected was on March 10, 1948. And shortly after this election, the temporary provisions against the Communist Rebellion were enacted, which effectively suspended the Constitution and established martial law. Therefore, the so-called National Assembly, elected in 1948, largely remained unchanged even after the KMT retreated to Taiwan, until its replacement in 1991. Starting in 1972, a small number of additional representatives were elected on a regular basis, but because the core members of this 1948 assembly that governed until 1991 was elected on the mainland, it was predominantly composed of 外省人. This was despite its effective jurisdiction being reduced to just the Taiwan area, where the overwhelming majority of the population were 本省人. And during martial law, democracy was restricted to city and county levels, where local governments were dominated by 本省人, elected by the people. These 本省人 typically came from more privileged backgrounds. So for decades, the ruling core of the so-called central government was composed of elite 外省人, while city and county governments were dominated by elite 本省人. So basically, the central government was dominated by the worst of 外省人, and the local governments were dominated by the worst of 本省人. These political factors contributed to the perception of the Taipei administration as being out of touch with the local population, and led to anti-外省人sentiments among some 本省人. So like I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, members of the local elite, mostly the landed aristocracy, enjoyed privileged positions in society under Japanese rule, because in addition to their economic position, the Japanese carried out a lot of its governance through these people. Now, when Taiwan was returned to China in 1945, the majority of Taiwan's population welcomed the KMT as liberators. But the KMT was focused on fighting the war on the mainland, and in Taiwan, it was mostly just concerned with consolidating its power and implementing its own administrative system. So it replaced many Japanese-era institutions and leaders with its own personnel, which greatly reduced the influence of local elites. And while all of this was going on, the timing was perfect. The people were experiencing hyperinflation, shortages, heavy taxation, on top of extreme government corruption. And eventually this led to what is called the 228 incident in 1947. And at some point I'm going to have a whole episode dedicated just to 228 because it's too much to cover over here. Long story short, a cigarette vendor selling unauthorized cigarettes was stopped by members of an enforcement team from the Tobacco Monopoly Bureau on February 27th, 1947. This turned into an altercation which sparked a protest. Then the protesters went to express grievances towards the government when a soldier shot into the crowd to disperse the demonstrators. And yeah, word spread throughout the island real quick and riots broke out all over. And in the middle of all of this chaos, some political activists began making demands like constitutional governance in Taiwan, the direct election of the provincial governor, or the establishment of a Chinese federation with provincial autonomy for Taiwan. At this time, these sentiments were mostly about political representation, and separatist sentiments were pretty mild, if present at all. But in addition to protesters making demands, hooligans who were Benshengren, or local Taiwanese, were out randomly attacking and even murdering, or worse, 外省人. Worse as in the R word. That doesn't mean slow. And this phenomenon began spreading throughout the entire island. So on March 8th, reinforcements from the mainland arrived, and the chaos was thoroughly quashed in June. Now, after all of this, Chiang Kai-shek basically used the ongoing Chinese Civil War as a reason to tighten his grip on power in Taiwan. He kept up this appearance of pursuing constitutional governance, but it was more about keeping control, and anyone who dared to challenge his authority, especially communists or even those just suspected of being sympathetic, faced serious consequences. Communists were either thrown in jail or executed, while Taiwan separatists were thrown in jail for treason, but typically weren't executed. So in 1947, Taiwan was already going through some rough times, partly because of the KMT's own missteps. Then came the big blow, which, as you know, was the KMT's defeat on the mainland in 1949. In response, Chiang's government started pushing land reforms in the 1950s to maintain political stability. Obviously, he learned some difficult lessons on the mainland, but more importantly, in Taiwan, he wasn't beholden to the big landlords like he was on the mainland, so he didn't really have to care about their feelings. And so the Chiang Kai-shek regime took land from the big landowners, compensated them with some stocks for government-owned enterprises, and distributed land to tenant farmers, which was a huge win for a lot of the rural population. But obviously, this didn't sit well with the local elites who were already not happy with the way the KMT was running things. Moving further into the 1950s, the government got really strict about Mandarinization. So if you don't know, during the Qing dynasty, Mandarin was spoken in Taiwan only among Qing bureaucrats, just like in any other part of China where Mandarin wasn't traditionally spoken. Because most people in Taiwan hailed from southern Fujian, the language spoken there, commonly known as Hokkien in English or Minanhua in Chinese, sometimes erroneously referred to as Taiwanese, was the most commonly spoken language here in Taiwan. Hakka people whose families arrived to Taiwan from the Meishan area in Guangdong traditionally speak Hakka, and the indigenous people spoke their indigenous languages. And of course, after 1949, you have people from all over the mainland with their own local languages and dialects. So from the 1950s, only standard Mandarin was allowed in schools, and there were tight limits on how much local languages and dialects could be used in media. And during this time, there were propaganda signs in schools saying things like, I will speak standard Mandarin, not local dialects. And if you broke this rule, you'd get punished, and punishment included timeout, wearing a sign that says, I will only speak Mandarin, getting hit on the hand with a stick, or even getting fined. Now, There was definitely a need for a common language, but the way that they went about it gave Taiwan separatists plenty of ammo to compare the KMT to Japanese colonizers who also had similar policies. As the KMT tightened its control over Taiwan, these sort of heavy-handed policies furthered the wedge between the mainland elite running the government and the local population in Taiwan. And this opened the door for the Taiwan separatist movement, which started to gain support among elites and intellectuals who were feeling increasingly squeezed. With the communist threat in Taiwan mostly under control, the KMT's actions like, taking land from the local elites and using harsh tactics created the perfect conditions for liberal opposition to start taking shape. The KMT was careful, though, and typically jailed Taiwan separatists rather than execute them because they didn't see them as the same level of threat as communists. But there was another layer to it, too. Taiwan separatists were mostly 本省人, or local Taiwanese, while communists in Taiwan were more often than not 外省人, since they came from the Chinese mainland and were more likely to have had contact with communists there. And because the separatist movement was fringe at the time, the KMT didn't see them as the kind of threat that they saw the communists as. So now let's talk about one of the earliest separatist figures in Taiwan who came from an elite family, Liao Wenyi. Now, Liao wasn't just any ordinary guy, as you can imagine. He came from one of the four major families in Xiluo Township, which is in Yunlin County. His father was a pretty big deal, a landed aristocrat who served as a township chief at one point. So thanks to his family's social standing and business connections and wealth, Liao Wenyi had the chance to study abroad in Japan, mainland China, and even in the United States. Before the 228 incident, Liao advocated for a Chinese federation of autonomous provinces. But things took a dramatic turn after the incident. When it all went down, Liao happened to be in Shanghai. When he heard of what was going on in Taiwan, he started organizing with other Taiwanese over there and formed the Formosan League for Re-Emancipation, 台湾再解放联盟, a group dedicated to the idea of freeing Taiwan from KMT control. The KMT wasn't particularly happy about this, as you can imagine, and therefore labeled him a conspirator of the 228 incident, even though he wasn't even in Taiwan at the time. Liao Wenyi was already pretty disillusioned with the KMT, but he wasn't exactly a fan of communism either. So this left him in a bit of a political no man's land, and over time his views started shifting towards Taiwan separatism. As the Chinese Civil War made things in Shanghai, where he was, increasingly volatile, Liao decided to move to Hong Kong in 1948, where he reestablished the Formosan League for Re-Emancipation. This is where things get really interesting, because it was in Hong Kong that Liao first started openly calling for Taiwan independence. So after Liao reestablished his organization in Hong Kong, his group issued a statement to the UN calling for Taiwan to be placed under trusteeship. So basically, they wanted the Western-dominated UN to manage the island for a while. And they also demanded an investigation into the KMT's treatment of the people on Taiwan. Their argument for Taiwan's independence was that the people on the island were of mixed ancestry and had no political ties to any neighboring countries, making a case that Taiwan deserved its own representation, especially in peace talks. Now, this sort of race science argument is pretty weak because it basically goes that, Taiwan's been under Dutch, Qing, and Japanese rule, and there were some children born to the Dutch and Japanese that made it into the gene pool in Taiwan, however negligible, and that the Han people in Taiwan also intermarried with Aboriginal people. But this logic falls flat when we look at the fact that China is not a Han ethno-state, but a civilization state with many ethnicities, which makes Taiwan not special at all in this regard, especially when the core of Taiwan's population observes Chinese culture and traditions, whereas the Japanese and Dutch never really integrated into Taiwan society. Anyways, the Formosan League for Re-Emancipation didn't last long, and by the end of 1948, the group had fallen apart because its members couldn't agree on their goals and strategies. Meanwhile, back in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek's regime was cracking down hard on anyone who supported the nascent separatist movement, trying to stamp out the ideology before it could spread. A lot of people at the time thought that Hong Kong would be liberated by the PLA, so Liao Wenyi ended up escaping on a forged passport to Japan. And when Japan regained its sovereignty in 1952, they allowed Liao to stay, which gave him a base to continue his activism. When he was in Japan, he founded the Formosan Democratic Independence Party, which established the so-called Provisional Government of the Republic of Taiwan. This was the first of many Taiwan separatist organizations that would base itself out of Japan, where most Taiwan separatists operated until the 1970s, when separatists in America became more relevant. Liao Wenyi even found some support from members of Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party, and I think this is very interesting to note because the LDP as a party supported Chiang Kai-shek, but from this we can tell that among its membership there were politicians who supported Taiwan separatism, which kind of tells us that they were hedging their bets on anyone that they could work with. Liao Wenyi's activities weren't limited to Japan though. He took his bullshit message to the world stage, attending international conferences like the Bandung Conference in Indonesia back in 1955. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Bandung. And over there, he tried to drum up international support for Taiwan separatism. So you can see that Taiwan separatism wasn't just a local issue, but it had international dimensions. And at this point, the ideology was more relevant to imperialists than it was to the average person in Taiwan. Now, officially, the US was allied with Chiang Kai-shek given Taiwan's strategic importance during the Cold War. But behind the scenes, the US was playing a bit of a double game. One way they did it was by offering limited and covert support to separatist organizations, like the one led by Liao Wenyi. And the idea was to keep Chiang Kai-shek on his toes and more compliant with US interests. So basically, Taiwan separatists were controlled opposition against Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang Kai-shek was controlled opposition against the CPC, and they hoped to make the CPC the controlled opposition against the Soviet Union. A prime example of this came in 1961 when the UN was about to vote on Mongolia's entry as a member state. Now, at the time, the so-called ROC based in Taipei was still the representative government of China in the UN, and the so-called ROC included Mongolia in its territorial claims. And as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Taipei had the power to veto Mongolia's entry, and they were basically going to do just that. So, to persuade the Taipei regime to not veto Mongolia's entry, the US played a bit of diplomatic chess and extended an invitation to Liao Wenyi, referring to him as the president of his so-called Provisional Government of the Republic of Taiwan, to meet with US officials. This was a big deal for Liao since it gave his movement some much-needed legitimacy, or it would have if it happened. But the invitation was abruptly rescinded when Taipei agreed to abstain from the veto. Now, this maneuver clearly showed Liao that he was being used as a pawn in a much bigger game. And after this incident, things started looking down for him. The KMT, which had already infiltrated his organization, cracked down hard, and many of his relatives back in Taiwan were arrested. And his income-generating assets over here in Taiwan were frozen. And his organization began to crumble as it struggled to recruit and retain members. And I think he was a full-time activist when he was in Japan, so his income-generating assets in Taiwan were basically what allowed him to survive. So you can see the problem here. Then in 1965, the KMT made Liao an offer that was very difficult for him to refuse. They promised to release his imprisoned relatives, unfreeze his assets, and grant him a pardon if he returned to Taiwan and publicly denounced Taiwan separatism. Liao accepted, but as you might have guessed, the KMT only partially fulfilled their promises. They released a few of his relatives and returned just some of his assets, but not all. Eventually, his Formosan Democratic Independence Party was dissolved, and by 1976, his so-called provisional government of the Republic of Taiwan also officially ceased to exist. This whole episode was a major blow to the Taiwan separatist movement, and many within the movement saw Liao's capitulation as a betrayal. But despite the collapse of the first Taiwan separatist organization, the movement itself didn't die. Eventually, the movement would find a new life and a new base across the Pacific and the United States, where it continues to evolve in coming decades. Now, the KMT's crackdown on dissent during White Terror wasn't just limited to communists or separatists. In fact, in 1960, a pretty significant dude named Lei Zhen got caught up in this wave of repression. Now, he was neither a communist nor a separatist, but was simply a strong advocate for democracy within the existing framework of the so-called Republic of China. Lei Zhen was the editor of a magazine called Free China, or 自由中国, which, just to be clear, wasn't the same as the KMT's own English language magazine called the Free China Review, the one that Carl Zha read at the library in Chicago when he was a kid. Lei Zhen's Free China was more of a platform for advocating democratic reforms and critiquing the government, and that put him on a collision course with the Chiang Kai-shek regime. One of the key issues Lei Zhen took on was Chiang Kai-shek's decision to serve a third term as leader, which Lei Zhen saw as a clear overreach of power. He didn't stop there, though, and he pushed for broader democratic reforms and even tried to form a new political party called the China Democratic Party, or 中国民主党. For a regime that was all about maintaining one-party rule, this was a step too far. So the KMT responded pretty swiftly and harshly. They shut down his magazine, and they arrested him, and they charged him with sedition. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which was a clear message that any challenge to the KMT's authority would be met with severe consequences. This incident was a big deal because it was one of the earliest and most high-profile cases of political repression involving someone who was neither a communist nor a separatist. His arrest highlighted just how intolerant the KMT was of any form of opposition, no matter where it came from. It also marked a significant moment in Taiwan's political history as it served as a catalyst for the rise of the liberal opposition movement that was a huge defining trait of the 1980s. Now, as the activities of Liao Wenyi were winding down in Japan, another influential figure in the Taiwan separatist movement began to rise, Peng Min-min. Born in 1923 into a doctor's family in rural Taiwan, Peng Min-min had an elite education that took him from Taiwan to Japan, where he attended Tokyo Imperial University. However, World War II interrupted his studies, and he was actually drafted into the war, but as he was trying to dodge his draft, he got caught up in a U.S. airstrike and lost his left arm, so he became exempt from service. So I guess you could say his draft dodging worked pretty well. Anyways, after the war ended, he returned to Taiwan to complete his undergraduate studies at National Taiwan University. When Peng Min-min arrived back to Taiwan in January 1946, he was shocked by basically how much of a shithole Taiwan was. Compared to how it had been under Japanese rule prior to the war, post-war Taiwan was a war-torn mess. And the Chinese soldiers who had arrived from the mainland were often poor and seemed overwhelmed by the modern conveniences that were common in Taiwan. Like, there were stories about soldiers who hadn't seen an elevator before, or a soldier who saw a water faucet somewhere, so he goes to the hardware store, buys a water faucet, sticks it on the wall, and is upset when water didn't come out. All sorts of those types of stories. Now, this stark contrast of living standards, combined with the chaos following the 228 incident, quickly led to Peng Min-min's disillusionment with the KMT. In 1951, Peng Min-min left Taiwan again, this time to pursue graduate studies in Canada, followed by a PhD in France. He returned to Taiwan in 1957 and began teaching political science at National Taiwan University, the most prestigious institution on the island. And his qualifications didn't go unnoticed, because Chiang Kai-shek himself appointed Peng Min-min as an advisor to the Taipei regime's UN delegation. The KMT also saw Peng Min-min as a useful tool to counter Taiwan separatism and urged him to investigate the movement in the US and to use his influence as a Benshengren from an elite background to persuade separatists to abandon their cause. However, Peng Min-min felt that the KMT was just trying to use him as a token Taiwanese, and this led him to distance himself from the party upon returning to Taiwan. Then, in 1964, Peng Min-min, along with two of his students, Wei Tingcao and Xie Congmin, drafted a Declaration for Formosan Self-Salvation, or 台湾自救运动宣言. This manifesto argued that one China and one Taiwan was already a reality and that major world powers had essentially recognized the two sides of the Taiwan Strait as separate entities, even if they hadn't officially established diplomatic ties with the PRC. This declaration also slammed Chiang Kai-shek's goal of reclaiming the mainland as a pipe dream meant to prolong his regime and justify martial law. And the manifesto pointed out that Chiang's insistence on reclaiming the mainland was a tactic to leverage the CPC in negotiations with the US to secure aid, because during this time, whenever negotiations between the KMT and the US hit a roadblock, news of negotiations between the KMT and CPC would coincidentally leak in Hong Kong and cause panic in the US. The authors of the manifesto pointed out that Chiang's regime didn't truly represent the people of either the mainland or Taiwan, given the fact that they were run out of the mainland, as well as how unrepresentative the so-called National Assembly and Legislative Yuan were of Taiwan's population. They pointed out how of the 3,000 plus representatives in the so-called National Assembly, only about a dozen were Taiwanese, and that only 6 of the 473 legislators in the so-called Legislative Yuan were Taiwanese. And the manifesto didn't just critique the KMT regime, but also called for all who opposed the CPC and Chiang Kai-shek to unite and push for a new democratic and free society in Taiwan. The authors even took a shot at the KMT's land reforms, suggesting that the real motive was to weaken potential opposition forces rather than to help the people. And although the manifesto's been translated into English in the past, I can't find an English translation of it, so I've translated it myself and will include it in the appendix of the book I'm writing. But here's what they wrote about land reforms. Many people believe that Taiwan's land policy was a benevolent act by the Chiang regime. In reality, the motive behind the land reforms implemented by the Chiang regime was to weaken potential opposition forces. Since the Qing dynasty, Taiwan's traditional political leaders had all come from the landlord class. I think the fact that they took a shot at the KMT's land reform, of all things, and the way they highlighted that, since the Qing dynasty, Taiwan's political leaders had always come from the landlord class, is a clear indication of the author's class sympathies. It's true that the land reforms did marginalize the landed aristocracy and weaken them, but I fail to see why anyone but people who sympathize with that class would see it as a bad thing during a time when most peasants were impoverished. Not to mention, if the land reforms weren't done, poor peasants may have formed a new and more numerous opposition force that challenged both the landed aristocracy as well as the KMT. Communists. Now, getting this manifesto out to the public wasn't easy, though. The first printer they approached refused to print it after realizing what it was about, and he ratted them out to the cops. This was during a time when if you knew someone was doing seditious stuff and you don't report them to the police and the police find out that you knew all along, you got in trouble too, so can't really blame him. Anyways, the trio found another printer and managed to distribute 10,000 copies by mail. Unfortunately for them, though, it wasn't long before the KMT authorities caught up with them. They were arrested, and because the manifesto exaggerated the level of support for their cause, the KMT assumed they were part of this large-scale conspiracy to overthrow the regime, possibly with US backing. So the following year, in 1965, Peng Min-min and Wei Tingcao were sentenced to 8 years in prison, while Xie Congmin got 10 years. News of their imprisonment spread internationally, drawing attention from Taiwan separatist groups in Japan and North America. And even Amnesty International got involved and declared Peng Min-min to be a prisoner of conscience. Under pressure from the US, Chiang Kai-shek eventually released Peng Min-min from prison, but kept him under constant surveillance. However, the KMT's intelligence community wasn't always the most diligent, and it appears that the agents assigned to monitor him would sometimes slip away and enjoy their day while on the clock, and then they would turn in fake reports. And Peng Min-min took notice of this, and because surveillance wasn't airtight, in 1969, Peng Min-min managed to obtain a forged passport and, in heavy disguise, fled Taiwan in 1970. It was a forged Japanese passport, and his heavy disguise was of this stereotypical Japanese man, which was actually pretty convincing. He first went to Switzerland, where he was granted political asylum while waiting for a US visa. According to a memo from John H. Holdridge to Henry Kissinger, the US Embassy in Taipei believed that Peng Min-min could become a key leader in the Taiwan separatist movement. So there was a lot of debate, or some debate rather, about whether or not to grant him a visa, as both the KMT and the CPC might view it as American endorsement of Taiwan separatism. But in the end, the US granted him the visa, and Peng Min-min moved to the US in September 1970, where he began working at the University of Michigan Center for Chinese Studies. Peng Min-min stayed active in the Taiwan separatist movement while in the US until he returned to Taiwan in 1992. During this time, as more Taiwanese students studied abroad in America, the US replaced Japan as the center of the Taiwan separatist movement. This shift would play a significant role in Taiwan's modern history, especially during the Jiang Jingguo era, as the Taiwan administration had to navigate shifts in US foreign policy towards Taipei and Beijing, while also dealing with a growing liberal opposition movement at home. In 1969, the same year Peng Min-min escaped from Taiwan, the Sino-Soviet split escalated dramatically when a border conflict broke out between China and the Soviet Union. And the growing animosity between these two communist powers didn't go unnoticed by the US. Seeing a chance to isolate the Soviet Union, the US began exploring potential rapprochement with Beijing, leading to increased diplomatic talks between Washington and Beijing and Warsaw. The KMT saw this engagement as an existential threat, so they sought to strengthen their ties with Washington. And in 1970, Jiang Jingguo, Chiang Kai-shek's son and eventual successor, who was then serving as the so-called vice premier, accepted an invitation from U.S. Secretary of State William Rogers for a 10-day visit to America. Members of the New York-based separatist organization called World United Formosans for Independence, or WUFI, saw an opportunity to make a bold statement. While they organized demonstrations in the cities where Jiang Jingguo traveled to, some members conspired to assassinate him, believing that doing so would draw international attention to their cause. Throughout Jiang Jingguo's trip, he encountered protests everywhere he went, but things were different on April 24th when Jiang Jingguo went to the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan for lunch with the Far East America Council of Commerce and Industry. As he was about to enter the hotel through a revolving door, a WUFI member named Huang Wenxiong managed to breach Jiang Jingguo's security detail before raising his gun and aiming directly at Jiang Jingguo's head. Just as Huang Wenxiong was about to pull the trigger, though, an American detective grabbed his wrist, causing the bullet to miss by 2 feet above Jiang Jingguo's head. Huang was quickly subdued, but not before shouting in English, "Let me stand up like a Taiwanese." An accomplice attempted to intervene, but was also taken down by the cops. And as both of them were escorted to a police car, they continued to shout, "Long live Taiwan independence!" Which I'm guessing they screamed it in Hokkien, so it'd be 台湾独立万岁. If it were Mandarin, it'd be 台湾独立万岁. This assassination attempt sent shockwaves among Taiwan separatists, and although it briefly energized the separatist movement in exile, internal divisions soon emerged over whether to pursue their goals through peaceful means or continue with more radical actions. For Jiang Jingguo, This attempt on his life may have been a turning point and likely played a role in his decision to reshape the KMT after he took over, moving away from its image as a party dominated by out-of-touch mainlanders and instead promoting local Taiwanese into higher levels of government. And with that, I think this just about covers the origins of the Taiwan Separatist movement. The next part of my Taiwan Separatist series will cover the liberal opposition movement during Jiang Jingguo's era, when the US was mounting pressure on the KMT to liberalize while also supporting the opposition movement that included many Taiwan separatists. Then we'll get into how, after liberalization, separatists like Peng Min-min flocked back to Taiwan and worked their way into government, the very government that they once sought to overthrow, and how we got to where we are today. So, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you guys found this episode to be engaging, easy to follow, and informative. And as always, if you got any feedback, feel free to reach out to me at straighttalk@xiangyu.tw. Make sure to subscribe to Straight Talk wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube or Rumble. Now I'd like to thank my upper-level patrons, Alvin Zhao, Wang Yijing, Pranav Sima, Michael Kim, Coconut, Victor, Alaskan Landbridge Project, CD14039, and Cabasa de Fogo. If you like what I'm doing and want to help this project grow, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon, becoming a member on YouTube, or by making a one-time donation to any of the links in the show notes. See you guys in the next episode.
还是人情